What is unconscious bias in the workplace and how is it affecting your team? Unconscious bias is one of the ways that your organization may be held back without you even knowing it. And tackling unconscious bias is critical to make sure that you're getting the most out of your team. By the end of this video, you will not only understand what unconscious bias is, but you'll also understand how you can make the unconscious conscious. That's one of the most frequent questions I get. Well, if it's unconscious, how can I become conscious of it? We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about how you can overcome unconscious bias in your organization to drive results. When we talk about unconscious bias, we're talking about the ways that we may have prejudice about certain types of people or certain groups without even realizing it. That's the unconscious part. Most often, when people think about unconscious bias, they think about race and gender. And that's true. There is a lot of unconscious bias about those things. But there are other types of unconscious bias that you might not even have thought of. For example, less than 7% of US men are over 6 feet tall. Yet, around 60% of corporate CEOs are men who are over 6 feet tall. Why is that? It's because there is an unconscious bias that many people hold that tall men have better leadership skills than short men. Now, does that make any sense? No, it doesn't make any sense, but it's unconscious. It's something we don't even realize. When we see a tall person, we feel that they have something that a short person doesn't have. So height is another example of unconscious bias. Weight is another one. Even the way that someone dresses can create unconscious bias in an individual that can negatively impact the workplace in so many different ways. Not only does unconscious bias keep us separate, but it affects our decision making. And in the workplace, that can be a serious problem. Unconscious bias can influence who we decide to hire in an interview process. It can influence who we promote. It can also influence more subtle things like who we listen to more intently when we're in a meeting and which clients we respond to more quickly. All of those have serious implications for workplace outcomes, and that's why it's important to tackle our unconscious bias, not just because it's the right thing to do. Now that you understand what unconscious bias is, I'm going to give you 5 steps for overcoming your own unconscious bias. And these are 5 steps that any of us can take that will help us overcome our own unconscious bias, because the question is not, do I have unconscious bias? The question is, what kinds of unconscious bias do I hold? Before I jump into those 5 tools, like and subscribe to this channel if this content resonates with you. The purpose of this channel is to unleash the power of culture, to inspire businesses and people to reach their full potential. And overcoming unconscious bias is one key way to do that. So what are those 5 steps? Number 1 is you have to acknowledge that your biases exist. You may not know what they are yet, but you have to overcome the idea that you are immune to unconscious bias. This isn't about being racist or being a bad person. This is about the natural way that the mind works. At any given moment, we are being exposed to thousands of experiences, thousands of things that our brain is trying to process. For example, right now, I'm seeing this camera. I'm also feeling what this dress is like on my skin. I'm also thinking about what I'm going to say next. I can feel my shoes on the ground. I'm thinking about the person who's in this room with me. I've got all of these inputs that my brain is trying to process. That and many, many more. But my brain can't handle that load all at once. And so it decides to focus on something. And the thing that it focuses on is where that unconscious bias starts to happen. When you meet someone for the very first time and you haven't spoken with them and you don't know anything about them, your brain is trying to process all of the inputs in that moment and it decides to focus on something. It could focus on their race, it could focus on their age, it could focus on their height, it could focus on anything. And that filter that your brain uses to decide what to focus on is unconscious. And that is where our biases can come out. So you have to acknowledge that everyone has unconscious bias, regardless of race or age or gender. We all hold biases. Once you acknowledge that you too have unconscious bias, you can start to identify what they are. So step 2 is to become aware of what your unconscious biases are. Now, this is that question that I said I get most often. If my unconscious biases are unconscious, how can I possibly make them conscious? Well, the answer is to notice your discomfort. Think about how many times you've met someone for the very first time and you had a first impression of that person. And that first impression, you found out later, was completely wrong. Maybe you befriended them and you got to know them more and you realized that first impression was totally false. Those first impressions are based on your unconscious bias, based on what that person looks like. How many times have you seen someone wearing clothes that you don't like the style of and you think, I won't get along with that person, just based on the clothes that they're wearing that day? Or you've seen someone with hair that's frizzier than yours and you've thought, I don't like frizzy-haired people. Well, that thought isn't conscious, it's unconscious, but it makes us hold ourselves back from someone. It makes us decide maybe they're not the kind of person that I would want to work with or I would want to get to know. So when you notice discomfort about someone, that is your clue. That is how you can know that perhaps you have unconscious bias about someone. And that takes us to step 3. Tap into your mindfulness. Slow down your decision making. When you meet someone for the first time, if you notice discomfort, then explore that discomfort. Be mindful about what thoughts are coming to your mind about that person and bring the unconscious forth. Let's do an exercise right now. You can close your eyes if you want. What do you think about when you think of someone who voted for the other candidate? What do you think about when you think about someone who loves handguns? What do you think about when you think about someone who's in a wheelchair? Now, if you felt uncomfortable about any of those, then that was step 2. You can notice the discomfort. Then you can move to step 3, explore that discomfort. Tap into your mindfulness. What about those thoughts that made me uncomfortable do I need to look into further? Now that you've tapped into that discomfort and you're exploring it, you're being mindful about those snap decision making that you make in those first impressions that may be your unconscious bias at work. Then step 4, act as if the bias doesn't exist. It's as simple as that. You just act as if. You have noticed that you felt discomfort and you've explored that discomfort, and now you're going to discard it. You're going to decide that that discomfort doesn't exist, that the bias isn't true for you, and you're going to act accordingly. You do not need to be a victim to your own unconscious thoughts. Let me give you an example in the workplace about how insidious this unconscious bias can be. Let's say you're hiring for a job and you've got 2 candidates that you've narrowed it down to, Mary and Chad. Mary went to your alma mater. I went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and so did Mary. Chad went to an Ivy League school. Now, I may have an unconscious bias that people who went to Ivy League schools are a bit snobby, but people who went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, my alma mater, are my kind of people. That is unconscious bias in action. Something about Chad, namely his school choice, made me uncomfortable. And I explored that comfort and realized that it was coming from a place of having bias about the school he attended. If I'm able to notice it and make that conscious, then I'm able to say, you know what? I'm going to act as if that bias doesn't exist, and I'm going to give both Mary and Chad equal opportunity to impress me in this interview process. That is how you act as if the bias doesn't exist. You slow down decision making to make sure that you're not making gut decisions based on bias. And the last tip, the 5th step for overcoming your unconscious bias, is to ask for help. If we all have bias, then we should all be able to support each other in overcoming those biases. You can ask your colleagues, you can ask your family, you can ask your friends to help you notice when your unconscious bias might be coming up. Have conversations with them about why that bias might exist. Think about experiences that you've had in the past that might be informing those unconscious bias, and create a network, a community of people who are also interested in removing their unconscious biases so that you can thrive together. If you're interested in receiving more tools like this on how you can create a workplace culture that drives results and also fulfills your employees, then go to gift.culture.io, or you can click on the description below to get access to free resources, research, and ebooks that will help you in your journey.